Welcome to All Access, where we meet at the intersection of healthcare and generic and biosimilar medications. Brought to you by the Association for Accessible Medicines, representing the generics and biosimilars industry. Welcome to All Access. I'm Dan Leonard. Typically on All Access, we focus on current events or future opportunities. But generics also have a great history. And our guest today is a veteran of the generic industry, Bob Billings. I call Bob the font, not because of the typeface he uses in his email signature, but because he is the font of all knowledge regarding our industry, the history of our industry. He's been a great resource for me at AAM. Bob has been active in the pharmaceutical industry for more than 25 years. He's held various positions in a number of generic companies, but also at GPHA, the predecessor of AAM. And from 2000 through June 2015, Bob was very active with the association, including a term as president and executive director. So I'm going to jump right into it, Bob. When you began your career in generics over 25 years ago, what was going on at that time in the space, and particularly with regard to the associations that were representing the membership? There were three associations, if I recall. Why was that the case? Why were there three trade associations, and how did that come out in the wash, if you will?
Well, thank you, Dan. We were just really trying to get our sea legs to some extent. Prior to Hatch-Waxman in 1984, there were very few generic drugs because the approval process, we called it the paper NDA process, was very uncertain in terms of getting a drug approved. It was complicated. Because of that, there weren't a lot of applications. There were several off-patent brands, large selling drugs, that had no generic equivalent approved by FDA. Of course, Hatch-Waxman changed all that. I think within the first year after Hatch-Waxman was enacted, that there were a little more than 1,000 ANDAs, abbreviated new drug applications, submitted to the FDA. So the industry really started taking off. And it wasn't long after that, because of the brand industry, the innovators trying to use various methods to slow the growth of generics or slow the substitution of generics, that the generic industry realized it needed to come together, form a voice, be at the table when policies are set and not on the menu, as they say, and really have a voice in setting policies. And so exactly why three associations as opposed to one or two or four, I'm not sure. It just sort of played out that way. I was most active in what was called the Generic Pharmaceutical Industry Association, GPIA. Another association, the National Association of Pharmaceutical Manufacturers, NAPM, they worked a lot on regulatory stuff. I know GPIA, we were very involved with Congress on policy issues, but it soon became clear, Dan, that we on some issues, we sort of had conflicting messages just a little bit. And we would be more productive being one voice. Not to mention FDA said, I'm tired of dealing with the three groups for you generics. You better get together like the brands and have one association. So the merger process began in 2000, and then in 2001, everybody had merged into the Generic Pharmaceutical Association.
So that's kind of an interesting take on the evolution of the associations representing the membership. But what was going on in the companies, right around Hatch-Waxman time, and many of us consider that the birth of the modern generic industry. What were some of the key challenges that were being faced by the companies then? A lot of those challenges coming up through the states, as I understand it. But what was really happening?
We did have challenges, and the challenges, some of them we've won subsequent to that. But the states, as you said, that was a real challenge for us in some areas. A drug, Coumadin, which a lot of people may know, warfarin, a blood thinner. The brand company was very, very successful in getting states to disallow automatic substitution of generics. As you know, state boards of pharmacies and state legislatures need to pass their own substitution laws, as we've seen with the advent of biosimilars, going through that again with states passing biosimilar substitution laws. And the Coumadin innovator would tell states that it is a very narrow therapeutic index drug, an NTI, that if you take too little of a dose, it does no good. If you take a little bit too much of a dose, it can be toxic to your body. Therefore, since it's got a very narrow therapeutic index, and generics can be anywhere from, they would say 80% to 120%, which they pulled out of the regs, but that did not mean 80 to 100% in terms of active ingredients. It was another statistical term, a confidence interval. In any case, they were able to tell state lawmakers, look, generics, they're not going to be as close as they need to be to the brand, and it can be dangerous. And that was the first big state battle we fought. We had a company called Bar Labs, now part of Teva. And Bar was extremely successful in building a national state organization. I think they had 30, 40 state lobbyists all across the country fighting these NTI, this warfarin battle. And then in 2000, or maybe it was 98, 99, Dr. Nightingale from the FDA wrote a letter to all state pharmacy boards saying, if FDA approves a generic, it can be as safe and effective, and it will be as safe and effective as the brand and have the same therapeutic effect. Citizens petition abuse was another. We would have citizens petitions filed right before a generic approval. The FDA would have to stop the approval process, answer the citizens petition from the brand, maybe requesting additional clinical trials or something, or additional BE studies to prove the generic is the same. Just a lot of issues back then, and so it was pretty challenging in the generic industry.
Yes, the early days, certainly some challenges and growing pains. I mean, we have no shortage of challenges now, but it's very interesting to hear how the industry evolved over those times and how the association represented the industry during those times. How did ultimately, how did the industry overcome those challenges that you just referenced in the States?
We didn't have the millions. We used to say that our friends on the brand side would spend millions to protect billions, which is pretty much true. And we didn't have the millions to spend, and we were very small and very young, but we felt we had the winning message. So we took the message to the Hill. And we had some real wins, not only in state legislatures with the Coumadin, for example, and getting automatic substitution, but as soon as states started seeing the savings and they saw that people were adhering to their medicines, getting healthier from generics, it almost became generics were well on their way in the states. On the federal side, we had to really go and do some hard sell, because our friends on the brand side did spend a lot in their political action committees and on lobbying to get things. But with our message, we were able to get bills like the Food and Drug Amendments Act, the FDAAA, that sort of changed the dynamics for multiple 30-month stays that brands would get to prevent FDA from approving generics. I believe it was the FDASIA, the Food and Drug Amendment Innovation Safety Act, that gave us the 5010, if I'm saying right, Q process for citizens petitions, where the FDA, if a citizens petition was filed within like 150 days of an approval date for an ANDA, the FDA did not have to stop the approval process to answer the brand company citizens petition. So through a series of wins, just like the one we had recently with the Creates in Congress, we were able to mature Hatch-Waxman to the place where it wasn't quite as challenging in some of these really challenging areas.
Well, I totally relate to those comments, because I've talked to our team. A lot of phrases like punching above your weight class, or my personal favorite, young, scrappy, and hungry. That's the way we kind of think of ourselves around here. And we're not going to outspend the brand companies, but our message is clear, and it's a great message for saving money and making sure that patients have access to affordable medications.
Yep.
And so, pretty much now everybody knows that story, that when generics come online and there's competition in the marketplace, we can save patients hundreds of dollars, thousands of dollars. We save systems millions and billions of dollars. $310 billion last year in savings overall. So that's a huge and great result from Hatch-Waxman. What are some of the other, benefits beyond just the saving story that came from Hatch-Waxman?
Dan, the one I like the most is the fact that competition spurs innovation. When we were first getting started, there were a lot of debates, and the same debate, by the way, was prevalent when we came on with biosimilars. That biosimilars, or in the case of the small molecule generics, that they would take away money from the brand, revenue from the brand company, and then the brand could not spend money on research and development. So by approving generics, you're harming research and development. That's been repeatedly proven not to be true. And I think the first one was in 1998, when the Congressional Budget Office came out with a study of the first 10 years after Hatch-Waxman, finding that spending on R&D actually increased in real dollars, or in adjusted dollars, something like 30%. And last year, I believe, was another record year of spending by the innovators on research and development. And what has come with that, as competition has increased, research and development has increased, we've gotten better medicines. In 1998 or 99, the biggest selling drug in the world was Zantac. Ranitidine is the generic name, Zantac. Today that's an over-the-counter drug. But back then it was the first blockbuster. Zantac was the first block, which by definition is a drug that sells $1 billion or more in a year. So Zantac was the first blockbuster. When the Zantac patent expired, the owner of the patent, the innovator company, had to invent something new. And instead of H2 antagonists, which Zantac was, which the anti-ulcerative of choice back then, we now have proton pump inhibitors, which are so much better at treating ulcer as an anti-ulcer. That came about largely because of generic competition. Because they say what, necessity is the mother of invention.
That's right.
Well, profits are the mother of innovation for the brand industry. You can understand that they must innovate, and it's the competition from generics. Had the patent not expired on ranitidine, Zantac might still be the largest selling drug in the world.
What are some of the other ones? What would be the other poster children, if you will, of Hatch-Waxman working the way it was ultimately, the way it was intended from the onset?
There are probably a few, and I'm sure some of my colleagues in industry would have maybe their own. To me, I thought the poster child, a good poster child, would be Prozac with the company I mentioned a while ago, Bar Labs. Fluoxetine is the molecule name. Bar challenged Prozac, which was selling, I think Lilly, the innovator, rang up somewhere around $2 billion in sales of Prozac the year before Bar challenged the patent. Bar went in and challenged the patent according to the Hatch-Waxman rules, was the first to file a substantially complete ANDA for Prozac, and they were sued by Lilly for patent infringement, and they ultimately won that patent fight. In fact, I believe it came down that Lilly had double patented, and as a result, the patent then was found to be invalid and unenforceable. At which time, Bar, like they're supposed to under Hatch-Waxman, got final approval from FDA for the generic version. And with that, as the first filer, Bar got the 180-day generic exclusivity period that Hatch-Waxman allows. Mm-hmm. That allowed Bar to make very good sales of that drug as generic. I think that the market went 80% generic within the first 6 months. Of course, Bar made good money. They got their investment back on the work they did, their legal battles and so forth. And then on day 181, when Bar's exclusivity was up, here comes a group of other generic versions that were approved. And suddenly the price, as we know, when there's 4, 5, or 6 generics for a certain molecule on the market, the price goes down to maybe 85, 90, 95% discount off the brand price. So it worked perfectly. Bar recouped their investment. They challenged a questionable patent and they won. They recouped their investment so they could invest in further development of generic drugs. More generics came on the market. Suddenly, consumers were saving billions of dollars.
Well, like you say, that's the way it's supposed to work, and in that case, it certainly did. It, you know, and sitting here today, it sounds almost quaint when you say they double patented, because now we know so many originator drugs that have multiple patents. So since Hatch-Waxman, if we're, you know, kind of marching forward in history, what have been some of the, you know, milestone events in the regulatory side, with new laws that have come into play that have changed the regulatory pathway, and what's been of most impact?
I think probably one of the most significant would be passage of the Medicare Modernization Act in 2003. First of all, Medicare Modernization Act gave us Part D, the Medicare Part D for seniors, which is very important. But on a regulatory side for generic companies, prior to MMA, it was possible for a brand company to do just as you said, have multiple patents. And with each one of those patents, the generic company had to certify to that patent listed in the Orange Book. That meant that after you certified to one patent and you fought the patent battle and you were hoping to get approval, suddenly up pops another patent. Now you've got to certify paragraph 4 to that patent and litigate that patent. And then just before approval, up pops another. And did you know that for every time you certify paragraph 4 to a patent, it puts a 30-month stay on approval at the FDA. The FDA is barred from approving your ANDA for 30 months. That's built into Hatch-Waxman, intended to give you time to resolve patent issues in that 2.5-year period before the FDA gives the approval. However, when you could have multiple 30-month stays, you could see where you would never get your approval. We were first to file, a company I was with, on paroxetine, Paxil. And I think we had to fight through 4 30-month stays that instead of running consecutively, they ran sequentially. It was like we never thought we were going to get done with 30-month stays. The MMA did away with multiple 30-month stays. They said it'd be the one 30-month stay basically on the drug. And so that was very important for generic companies. That was a big battle for us. Former Senator McCain was instrumental in helping us. That Senator Schumer was instrumental in helping us get that passed. But that was a big battle. It also ushered in forfeiture of the 30-month stay for some companies who would get an approval as the first to file and had the 180-day exclusivity, and someone else is sitting there waiting for approval, but they can't because they have to wait for 180 days until the first filer launches. And the first filer decided for whatever reason it wasn't ready to launch that product, so it held up all subsequent approvals. Well, there's forfeiture provisions that are now on the books because of the Medicare Modernization Act that go into effect. So there was a very important piece of legislation for us.
What about industry itself and the players in industry? You know, many of whom are, or a few of whom are still around, that were here 20 plus years ago, but there's been a lot of M&A activity over that same period of time. How have you watched the industry grow and contract, and what has that meant as things have moved forward?
M&A, of course, is inevitable. I mean, that's the growth. There are very few companies. I think Apotex may be one that relies almost totally on organic growth. Other companies do get involved in M&A. I think more from a personal standpoint, it was always hard. We have a small industry, and you always have such good friends, and then suddenly 2 companies merge. You have friends of each, and you know one of them's not going to be there anymore. So there were these personal feelings. I can remember going to a GPHA annual meeting one year, and I believe that year I happened to be the chairman of the Government Affairs Committee. So we have about 30, 40 people around the table, the government affairs people from all the companies, and we're going around and calling the roll. And it was amazing. The year before, the same people were there, and everybody was from a different company. It seemed like this year I went around and called the roll. It seemed like half of them had now worked for Teva, because Teva went through an amazing period of acquisitions. In like 2006 or so, they got IVAX and a bunch of other companies. And I think it was all of a sudden, well, maybe we should just have our board meeting in the Teva room or whatever, because of the mergers and acquisitions. But it was a very important time for industry. Now, there have been a lot of new companies, of course, come on the scene. Today, we have probably more companies, more generic companies now than we had back then. so a lot of investors, for example, analysts think there's a real need for further consolidation in the generic industry. But back then there were some very large mergers. We used to have Watson, Andrex, Ivex, and anybody listening to this who's been around for 15 or 20 years, they'll remember those names. They were our big players along with Mylan and Teva. And we had those big companies, and a lot of them are now gotten together.
What has been your perception of this us versus them, brand versus generic, David versus Goliath approach? How does that? How do you feel about that today? Does that still hold up?
I always was a firm believer and a preacher of the idea that by definition there wouldn't be a generic unless there was a brand. We've got to have a product to be a generic of. And I can remember telling folks if I had an opportunity to hire someone and bring them into the trade association when I was there during an orientation, that we're not anti-brand. What we are anti and what we are fighting for is a level playing field. We're not against innovation at all. We are against gaming the system. We need innovation, and generics are where access and innovation intersect. It's the innovation that provides us our future. I was glad to see the IQVIA report just what came out last week of May, and they had a chart in there showing the number of brands that are going to lose patent protection and exclusivity over the next 5 years. I think it was $138 billion in brand sales that will be opened up for generic competition. This is our future. Some very big drugs you see advertised all the time, Opdivo and Trulicity, and those drugs are losing protection. So we need the brands. We otherwise, if we don't have innovation, then we don't have a future as generics. So it's not really a brand versus generic per se, although we have had some difference of opinion. We've had some similar opinions over the years. Our bottom line should be the same, and that's to make sure that medicines get to the people who need them. And our bottom line should be the same, that we protect innovation, but when patents and exclusivities are up, then consumers have the right to a lower cost product. And that's the way the system was designed to work. That's the way I believe it is working. And our biggest fight has always been just give us a level playing field. No shenanigans, as Commissioner Gottlieb would say, and let's just have a level playing field and let's move forward that way. That's what we always fought.
Yeah, no, 100% agree with you on that, Bob. And having come from the brand side of the business before coming to AAM, I have an appreciation for what goes into the innovation and R&D and making sure that there's new work being done on cures and new therapies, and that's great, and we need to support that. But when that exclusivity period is coming to an end, we need to make sure that the road is paved for the generics to come in and bring competition to the scene, and that's where the real savings takes place.
I think that there's a lot of runway left for us, because now and we've got to adapt, I think, as an industry, and there are people much smarter than I that know this and working on this. But we're coming to a day, and I think you said this, Dan, in your speech at the last Trade Association annual meeting, that we're coming to a day when we're not going to have the Zocors and the Lipitors and the drugs that can be given to millions and millions of people. We're going to have a time when there's more personalized drugs and different types of therapies, and generics have got to be there to provide competition at the appropriate time when exclusivities are up, in order to continue our track record of savings and access. And so there's a lot of runway ahead for us, although I think it's going to be different, a little different than it's been over the last 20 years, 30 years, especially considering biosimilars, complex generics, and so forth. So there's as long as brand companies are innovating, there's going to be a need for a good, affordable generic at some point to save the consumer money. And that's our future. And I have total confidence as we get into 21st century cures, and as we get into other things that the brands are doing to innovate new medicines, that we're going to have a good future in generics, in biosimilars, in complex generics. And so there's a lot of good runway left for our industry. I'm confident of that.
Well, that's great perspective, Bob, and I thank you for joining us today on All Access. This has been a great history lesson for me and for our listeners and viewers, so I really appreciate it. And we'll see you real soon. Thanks, Bob.
Thank you, Dan. It's been my pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you on the next edition of All Access.